Well, that was a bait and switch. I watched a video recently, one of these Sydney Opera House videos, the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, and the guest speaker was Alyssa Nutting. She's an author. And the title of the presentation was Women Are Sexual Predators. Now, one could be forgiven for thinking that they were going to address the issue of women as sexual predators, but that's not really what happened in what I guess you would really imagine if you were thinking deeply about the subject would be, it was going to be an explaining away. Essentially, Alyssa was talking about how we give women a pass for their violence, for their predation in society, and why that might be. She didn't really address the women being sexual predators or women being, women's violence at all. She addressed why, as a society, we tend to give them a pass. And I have to say, I came away from watching the video thinking, well, if we are giving women a pass for their violence, sort of explaining it away, what we don't need is an explaining away of the explaining away. Of course, she gave the usual rationale, the usual feminist rationale, that it's because of a lack of equality, that we are not willing to extend to women the power that we associate with villainhood. And she used several examples from the media to illustrate the point. These are very selective by necessity. She used the TV show Dexter, in which she talked about, he being the villain and he's very powerful. And there's a wrapping up of male sexuality with this power. And that they brought in a couple of female characters who were villainous as well, but they had limited villainhood. And they seemed to just need to get it out of their system. And then they weren't so bad anymore. And in the one case, one even became a mother afterwards. In fact, a mother to apparently Dexter's son. I don't watch the show. And that this is the reason behind this is because we don't want to, as a culture, extend the same villainhood to women, the same power that is connoted with that villainhood to women as we do men. There are obviously some problems with this, not the least of which being there's a bit of an issue sometimes using popular culture to explain common culture. So, for instance, there's plot devices involved, and so I don't think it does too well for the continuity of the story if you have villains that trump the main villain, right? The Dexter character himself. So there's a need to have them be somewhat down in the hierarchy. But the explanation given is sort of expected to be taken without any critical analysis itself. That her answer for the reason that these women have their villainhood reduced is that we don't want to extend that power to women of villainhood the way we would with men. Now, I would argue, first of all, that there's a greater power in creation than there is in destruction. At least virtuous power anyway. You look at sort of Adolf Hitler versus Mother Teresa. If you assume that the standard story about Mother Teresa. Anyway, and there's a greater virtue in creation than destruction. So I would argue that the power being held here really is by the woman who becomes a mother. And this really illustrates the other side of the coin that I think Alyssa Nutting is missing. And that is, you could look at it that we don't want to extend this power to women that we do to men, and of villainhood, of being truly monstrous. Or you could look at it that we see women as redeemable. And men's violence, men's evil is irredeemable. Certainly the Dexter character, from what I can tell, is sort of that irredeemable monster. And what more redemption than to become a mother, to become a nurturer, right? And I think this is illustrated in the way we view men in general and women. So in other words, it could be that we give women a pass for their violence, or it could also be that we don't give men a pass for their violence. There's different ways of looking at this. And I think she misses the mark. Obviously, she misses the mark in just calling out the violence. Again, I don't think we need an explaining away of the explaining away. I think what we need to do is call out the violence for what it is and give women, these women, the women who are violent, the agency of responsibility, and not try to make excuses for their behavior. I mean, just imagine trying to make the argument the other way. Imagine talking about men's violence and the fact that society gives them a pass for their violence, and here's the reasons why we give men a pass for their violence, the feminist camp would be saying, never mind any of that. You're not helping anybody here. Teach boys not to rape, right? So, I mean, it's a very, very weak argument that just wants to once again paint the patriarchy and men as being the problem, and not really addressing the women's the violence that women perpetrate. In fact, if this argument if this argument works, if this methodology were to work, this idea of teaching boys not to rape, which Alyssa Nutting did mention in her particular video, in her talk. She talked later about her daughter and wishing that she could I'm paraphrasing here, but that she could dress provocatively without provoking, which is kind of interesting. But and that's not to say that I think that a woman shouldn't be able to dress scantily clad without negative ramifications. But if you're going to dress provocatively, your intent is to provoke. Maybe she misspoke, but she did mention teaching boys not to rape in there. Well, if this is such a worthwhile strategy in a discussion that actually wasn't supposed to be about boys raping, it was supposed to be about women being sexual predators, where was the discussion about teaching women not to predate, not to commit acts of violence and statutory rape upon young men, which is sort of more or less what she was discussing, these rash of school teachers that groom young men for sex and get involved with them. Which actually brought to mind an interesting dilemma, and that is, she was talking about how we as a society will discuss the fact that in giving these women a pass, we'll discuss the fact that perhaps the boy brought some liquor to her house, whether under whose urgings I don't know, but and got them drunk, and that this is even entered into some court decisions or court discussions, I guess. And I thought, well, there's an interesting one, because we often hear about, the affirmative consent that everybody talks about, and how if a woman has been administered, if a woman has drank alcohol, then she can't give her consent. And people don't often talk about what happens if both partners are equally intoxicated. How come it is that the agency seems to be placed on the man in that case? And I thought, well, here's an interesting dilemma. You've got, on the one hand, a woman who's been administered alcohol, as they like to say. So she can't be responsible, but yet the male in the situation is a minor. So whose transgressions trump whose here? Anyway, I think that's an interesting dilemma. Not really, because I think it's pretty clear. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that to teach anybody not to commit rape or violent crimes is a working strategy, because they already know it, right? Teach boys not to rape. Rapists know that what they're doing is wrong. They do it anyway, and that's what we need to address. Why is it that they do it anyway? And the same is with women who commit acts of violence and sexual predation on minors. They know it's wrong. School teachers certainly know that it's illegal, that it's wrong, that it's immoral, and they're doing it anyway, and that's what we need to address. But if this is really a worthwhile strategy, according to the feminists, I think it would be reasonable to expect some consistency here, and calling out women on their violence and their predation would have to include then teaching them not to commit these things. And actually, I think that would extend to what is really the elephant in the room, and that is violence against children. Because the greatest perpetrators in the West of violence against children are women. And one would only have to imagine that some of these children are affected to such a great deal that they become adult perpetrators themselves. And so, we can't end a cycle of abuse if we don't recognize that there's such a thing as a cycle of abuse. Now, I'm not saying that the cycle of abuse sort of ends with the women who perpetrate violence against children. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, that it probably goes back further than that. They probably were predated upon themselves. But again, we can't end a cycle of violence if we don't recognize that there's a cycle of violence. I often think about my own experience with my father and my daughter when it comes to cycles of violence, because my grandfather was quite violent with his kids. He beat the shit out of my dad and the rest of his kids. And my dad's mom contributed to that to some degree by playing a lot of head games with the kids, and she would kind of set them up. And then, when father gets home, and so there was a lot of head games played, and they didn't really have a safe place. But my dad didn't visit any of that violence on my brother and I. He effectively ended that kind of violence in a single generation. I think it's pretty astounding, really, pretty admirable. And I think about my own daughter and the way I've raised her. I've never, ever struck her. She's never been spanked. She's never been aggressed against in that way. I yelled at her one time, and I apologized for it later because I had no right. I had no business yelling at her. I just sort of lost my cool. I have a hard time believing that the kind of violence that my dad experienced is going to reemerge in my lineage based on that, based on the peaceful parenting that I've engaged in. My dad was a little bit more distant with me, but in some ways it's kind of understandable. I mean, he was not equipped. He was not equipped to be a really close parent. He did, I think, really, there's a phrase that people use, people doing the best they could with what they knew at the time. I think here it's actually applicable that he really did do his best. He was only equipped to go so far. And again, I think, when it comes to violence against children, child abuse and that sort of thing, these things need to be called out for what they are. And we need to stop explaining it away, and we need to not worry about explaining away the explaining away. And again, I think that when it comes to the explaining away, Alyssa Nutting is missing a very obvious point. And that is, we see women as redeemable and men as irredeemable, at least their violence. When men are criminal, we see them as irredeemable, as evidenced by the very example that she used. The woman who was violent became, of all things, a nurturer. She became a mother. I mean, how much more redemptive can you get than becoming a nurturer? And, to some degree in our modern culture, maybe I should say feminist culture, men are seen as irredeemable anyway. Our basic characteristics are those very qualities of us that make us irredeemable. So when it comes to women, of course, one of their main biological drives is to have children, to nurture. Men have biological drives as well, to procreate and also to protect. And those two things have been demonized by particularly feminists. I don't think traditionalists do, of course, and I think actually the average everyday person in our society doesn't demonize men for those traits. Regular, everyday, average, reasonable people tend to reject modern day feminism, so they don't really see that. Sort of every family out there recognizes the value of these things, I think. But men's sexuality is seen as a negative. It's demonized, it's trivialized, it's cartoonized. In this very discussion, she talked about some of the men who had written her from prison with regards to some of her novels. Her books are decidedly twisted, and she has female villains in them that have, weird sexual perversions, I guess, and that she'd been written from prison, that this was twisted boner material. And she trivializes this throughout the discussion. That's how men's sexuality is trivialized. She talks about women not having an affirmative sexuality. I think she's right, actually. And there's a couple of things I would applaud her on in her talk. That's one of them. The thing that she misses, though, is I don't think men actually have an affirmative sexuality nowadays either. And I could make the case for that. There are several good reasons that I feel that way. I think that our sexuality in general in the West is a very strained, constricted, weird thing. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that none of us, men or women, are really free to openly and honestly express ourselves. And, feminists will talk all day long about how women are constricted sexually, but they don't really want to address the way that men are. And this trivializing, this cartoonizing that she does by just talking about boner material is sort of an example of that. And of course, men's drive to provide and to protect is trivialized and even demonized by modern feminists as well. The whole idea of patriarchy theory. I mean, the real patriarch is that, right? Is the provider, is the protector, so that the female can nurture, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we live in a different cultural paradigm, and so I think those things are due to be called into question. I I've often said culture needs to die in a fire, and we don't have the same biological necessities and the same logistical necessities to operate that way. A woman can provide financially for an entire family, professional woman, and many do, and there are lots of stay-at-home dads. So I'm not making the case for traditionalism here, but I think it is sad to think that men's sort of biological drive itself is what's demonized. So we see men as irredeemable. And I just think that Alyssa Nutting really missed the mark in her entire talk. She didn't actually address women as sexual predators or women as violent in the cases where they are. She just wanted to explain away the explaining away. And in fact, she had one opportunity. Everybody in the audience seemed to be clapping and applauding for everything. And the questions kind of greased her palm in that sense. There was one question during the Q&A portion, someone saying, a woman got up and said, I came to hear about women as sexual predators, and really all I heard was a bunch of man bashing. And this was Alyssa Nutting's opportunity, if she had any intestinal fortitude, to recognize a challenge and say, I'll take that question. She allowed the presenter to, or the interviewer to say to the questioner, oh, I'm sorry your needs weren't met, and we'll just move on. And she didn't, she sat quietly, Alyssa Nutting did, while the question went by the wayside. And I think that's unfortunate because, this was a bait and switch, purely a bait and switch. And I say, if teaching boys not to rape is a valid strategy, then teach women not to sexually predate on minors and teach women not to abuse children, because I think that's actually an epidemic that's unaddressed. And also, let's have a little bit of a discussion about violence by proxy that women often engage in, and false allegations of child abuse in divorce situations and things like that. So once again, it's one of these deals where the common language that's used amongst feminists gets an applause, and people seem to swallow this stuff hook, line, and sinker without giving it too much thought, and no real attempt to address female aggression in that video. And I just wonder if we're ever going to be able to have any real discussions about violence, real discussions about child abuse, real discussions about female sexuality, self-actualized affirmative female sexuality, which is something I've thought is very important for a very long time, and open and honest discussions about male sexuality and what it truly is and what it truly means. These feminists seem to think that men and masculinity is about power and sexual conquest. And the one thing she's forgotten to do is to ask any men. And, maybe I'm not a man, because it's not about that for me. My masculinity is not hinged upon sexual conquest or any of the things that I do. Now, it could be that I'm fortunate in a lot of the things, I ride motorcycle, I watch auto racing, I'm a mechanic, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it could be that I'm just fortunate that a lot of the things that I naturally gravitate towards are things that are considered to be traditionally male, and so I'm not really challenged in my masculinity. But by the same token, I've cross-dressed before. It didn't bother me too much. I play Grand Theft Auto as a female character, and I'm forever going into the Ponsonbys store and rearranging her outfit. Do these shoes match these earrings, sort of a deal. And my wife has kidded me about being more of a girly girl than she is. Do I give a shit that you know that about me now? Not really. It doesn't threaten me. But according to these feminists, I've got a lot of energy wrapped up in my power and my sexual conquest and that sort of thing. And we just don't seem to be able to have any real dialogue about that. Maybe they don't care. I don't know. I do. I'd like to engage, but it seems like you can't get beyond the paradigm that they're operating from. Let me know what you think.